Hey guys, tonight we're stepping onto the narrow sidewalks of 1930s Brooklyn, where butcher shops spill the smell of fresh meat into the winter air, and corner stoops echo with the clipped chatter of men in fedoras. The street lamps burn dim, casting long shadows across cobblestones slick from the morning's delivery carts. Here, a boy named Paul Castellano weaves between the bustle, his sharp eyes catching every handshake, every exchange of folded bills that passes for business in his neighborhood. You probably won't survive this world, most don't, but Paul isn't just surviving, he's learning. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Post your location and your local time in the comments. I'm always curious where in the world you're listening from. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The Brooklyn of Paul's boyhood isn't the glossy borough that later becomes a hipster postcard. In the 1930s, it's a gritty stretch of immigrant enclaves where Sicilian and Neapolitan dialects pour from open windows, and bread is baked before sunrise because that's the only way to keep up with the day's orders. Paul's parents, Giuseppe and Concetta, bring more than old-world recipes with them when they step off the boat from Sicily. They bring a code. It's not written down, but it's lived. Respect for family, loyalty to your own, and an understanding that disputes can be settled more efficiently outside of courtrooms. Giuseppe runs a small butcher shop, and young Paul quickly learns that meat is more than sustenance. It's a currency. He watches his father work the counter, always ready with a precise cut, always knowing which customer gets the better price, and which one should feel the subtle pinch of a higher bill. The shop is a meeting place too. Men stop by not just for pork chops, but for quiet conversations in the back. Paul doesn't hear all the words, but he hears enough to know that the meat business has layers. Some customers pay in cash, others in favors, and a few leave with nothing more than a nod. Payment deferred until some unspoken debt comes due. As a boy, Paul isn't roughhousing in the streets like the other kids. He's behind the counter, sweeping sawdust, running errands, and absorbing every nuance of customer interaction. That's not to say he doesn't know the streets. He walks them daily, delivering wrapped parcels through alleys and across blocks where certain faces linger a little too long in doorways. He begins to notice that some men seem to glide through the neighborhood, unbothered by the police, always greeted with respect or fear. It's in these early years that Paul develops his trademark detachment. While others seek excitement, he seeks control. He learns that the loudest man in the room is rarely the one in charge. In his neighborhood, authority often belongs to the man who says the least, listens the most, and moves the pieces from the shadows. This silent observation becomes his strongest skill, one that many people still think gave him the edge when he later navigated the turbulent hierarchy of organized crime. So, what do you think? Does silence truly make the man? Or is it the reputation that grows from it? When Paul isn't in the shop, he's often at home, where his mother keeps the house in strict order. Concetta is a quiet enforcer of discipline. Homework comes before supper, shoes are polished, and any slip in manners is corrected with the kind of tone that leaves no room for negotiation. This is where Paul learns another skill that will serve him for decades: maintaining composure. Even in moments of tension, he keeps his voice level, his body still, and his eyes steady. By his early teens, he's already showing signs that he's different from the boys his age. They dream of quick money from petty theft or joining the local crew to prove themselves. Paul has no interest in flash or street scraps. He's interested in longevity, how to build something that lasts. He understands that standing in the limelight is dangerous. Far better to own the stage from behind the curtain. Brooklyn's docks, just a trolley ride away, hum with another lesson in power. Longshoremen unload crates of fruit, coffee, and imported goods, but only certain men control which shipments get priority and which sit until they spoil. Paul sees how the right handshake at the right time can make or break an entire business. He's starting to understand that in this city, influence is the real currency, and it's rarely written in ledgers. Still, his world is small. The butcher shop, the family home, the streets between. But within that small radius, Paul is building a mental map of alliances, grudges, and obligations. He doesn't know it yet, but this map will one day guide him through the labyrinth of the Gambino family's business empire. Paul's family doesn't just bring recipes and work ethic from Sicily, they bring stories. Around the kitchen table, after the last customer has gone and the shop is swept clean, the conversations shift into a language thick with memory and old-world weight. Names of uncles, cousins, and godfathers float between the smell of espresso and fresh bread. These aren't just casual family anecdotes, they're quiet lessons wrapped in nostalgia, each one reinforcing the idea that loyalty is life's greatest currency. Giuseppe, his father, often speaks of his own youth in Palermo. The port city was alive with the clang of ship bells, the scent of citrus from groves just beyond the hills, and the watchful eyes of men who knew every transaction that took place on their streets. Paul listens carefully when his father explains how, in Sicily, respect isn't given. It's earned through action, patience, and the ability to protect what's yours without inviting unnecessary noise. There's pride in these words, but also caution. The sea is deep, Paolo, Giuseppe tells him more than once, and not every fish you see should be caught. The Castellano home runs on a strict schedule. Breakfast is early, work begins without complaint, and the children are expected to contribute without question. Paul's mother, Concetta, keeps the household in a state of order that borders on ceremonial. Laundry is hung with precision, meals are plated with care, and guests are treated like visiting dignitaries. This is not just about pride, it's about presenting a united front, a family that can't be picked apart by outsiders. By the time Paul reaches his teenage years, he's absorbing these lessons with a quiet intensity. He doesn't have to be told twice that the world beyond Brooklyn is full of opportunities and dangers. The Great Depression has left scars on the city, but it has also created openings for those willing to fill the gaps left by failing businesses. Men who can provide stability, or the illusion of it, become essential to their communities. Paul's extended family includes several distant relatives who already have reputations in New York's underworld. They're not the headline-making kind, but their names carry weight in the right circles. One uncle, in particular, is known for handling disputes between rival market owners without ever involving the police. Paul studies the way this man moves, never hurried, never flustered, and always leaving a room with the conversation firmly in his favor. Many people still think that these were the early blueprints for Paul's later style as a mob boss, built not on brute force, but on calculated influence. Would you agree? Or do you think the seeds were planted even earlier, in the butcher shop's back room? Sundays are the exception to the family's work-first rule. On those days, after Mass, the Castellanos visit relatives or host gatherings of their own. These events are part feast, part strategy session. Long tables are set with pasta, roasted meats, and trays of cannoli, while the older men speak in low tones about shipping schedules, supply shortages, and the rising prices of imported goods. Paul notices that these talks are often punctuated by subtle gestures, a glance toward a closed door, a pause in conversation when a certain name is mentioned. He doesn't yet know the full meaning, but he understands enough to realize that information is as valuable as any product. In school, Paul is not the most outstanding student in terms of grades, but he excels in understanding people. Teachers describe him as quiet but attentive, with a knack for reading a room. He doesn't seek attention, yet somehow, classmates tend to follow his lead. Even then, he understands the subtle balance of influence, when to speak, when to let silence do the work, and when to make someone believe that an idea was theirs all along. His reputation in the neighborhood begins to form. Older boys who might otherwise pick on someone his age leave him alone, partly because they've heard of his family, and partly because Paul carries himself with an unusual calm. He doesn't rise to provocation, and that, in itself, unsettles people who expect an easy reaction. The streets of Brooklyn in the late 1930s are a patchwork of opportunity and risk. Speakeasies have given way to more open forms of nightlife since Prohibition ended, but gambling dens, backroom card games, and unlicensed operations still thrive in certain pockets. Paul, while not directly involved, is aware of their presence. He notices who walks into these places, and, more importantly, who walks out smiling versus who walks out with their head down. By 15, he is helping his father manage supplier relationships. This means visiting warehouses, negotiating delivery times, and ensuring the quality of goods. It also means shaking hands with men whose approval could make or break the shop's standing in the local network of businesses. Paul learns to listen more than he talks, mirroring the behavior of the men who hold the most sway. One afternoon, while making a delivery, Paul witnesses a confrontation between two market stall owners over a shipment of lamb. The argument escalates, voices rise, but before any physical fight can start, a third man arrives. He doesn't raise his voice, doesn't threaten, but within minutes the dispute is settled. Both parties leave appearing satisfied. Paul can't hear every word, but he catches enough to understand the power of authority when it's wielded with precision instead of noise. These moments, small, easily overlooked by others, are where Paul's education truly happens. Not in a classroom, not from a textbook, but from watching human nature unfold in real time. And in the quiet, he files it all away, building an understanding of control, trust, and leverage that will one day make him a formidable figure far beyond the walls of his father's butcher shop. The butcher shop isn't just a place for customers to buy meat. It's a hub for news, favors, and subtle exchanges. By the early 1940s, Paul has grown tall, his features sharpening into the calm, watchful expression that will become his signature. His hands are strong from cutting meat. His suits, though modest, are always clean and pressed. Even at this age, he's beginning to cultivate an image, reliable, respectable, and above all, discreet. The Second World War is changing the rhythm of New York. Many young men ship out to Europe or the Pacific, leaving gaps in the city's workforce. With less competition and more demand, certain businesses, like Giuseppe's, find ways to flourish. Meat is rationed, but in neighborhoods where the right connections exist, rationing is more of a suggestion than a rule. Paul quickly learns the mechanics of bending those rules without breaking them outright. He watches his father work the front of the shop like a diplomat. Customers who've been loyal for years get their cuts reserved without asking. New faces are treated politely, but not with the same familiarity. And then, there are the special deliveries, the ones that leave through the back door, wrapped differently, addressed to no one in particular, yet always picked up promptly by someone who never pays in cash. Paul's extended family remains an ever-present influence. One cousin is involved in the poultry markets, another in produce, and each seems to navigate their own trade with an ease that comes from understanding which palms need greasing. Family gatherings now carry an unspoken agenda to discuss supply, territory, and the occasional problem in a way that keeps the children entertained, but the details vague. Paul, however, is no longer a child who needs distracting. He catches fragments of these talks about inspectors, about men from downtown, about moving things along without fuss. By 16, Paul has developed a mental checklist for sizing people up. He notes how they dress, how they carry themselves, and most importantly, whether they make eye contact. He's not looking for trouble, but he's already storing away the kind of information that can one day be useful. Many people still think that these observational skills became his greatest asset as a boss, letting him read a room and steer outcomes without ever tipping his hand. Do you think that kind of perception is learned or born into someone? The meat market is also teaching him about leverage. During one particularly harsh winter, a supplier's shipment is delayed by snowstorms. Several businesses run short, but Giuseppe's shop never seems to. Paul notices his father quietly arranging for deliveries to come at night, unloaded behind the shop, long before the streets are plowed. No one asks where the extra supply comes from, and Giuseppe never explains. The message is clear. When you can provide what others can't, they'll owe you more than money. Outside the shop, Brooklyn is shifting. Returning soldiers bring back not only stories, but also a desire for a better life. Construction projects pick up, neighborhoods expand, and money, both legitimate and not, flows into the borough. It's around this time that Paul starts venturing into parts of the city he's only heard about. Little Italy, with its packed cafes and narrow streets. The Fulton Fish Market, where business begins before dawn. And the bustling docks, where crates come in from far-off places with contents not always listed on the manifest. Paul's trips are often under the guise of deliveries or errands, but they're also reconnaissance. He's learning who controls which areas, who answers to whom, and which businesses seem untouchable. He notices that in every district, there are a few men who walk as if the sidewalks belong to them, their presence shifting the air in a way that makes others step aside. He's not meeting these men yet. He's watching from a distance, filing away their names and habits. One evening, a small incident cements his understanding of discretion. A neighborhood acquaintance is picked up by the police for selling stolen goods. The next day, his family claims he was at home the entire time. No one contradicts them, not even those who saw him leave with the stolen items. Paul realizes that in his world, truth is flexible, but loyalty is absolute. It's not about who's right. It's about who you protect. By the end of his teens, Paul is more than a butcher's son. He's a young man with a clear sense of how power moves, quietly, deliberately, and often invisibly. He's not in a rush to make his mark. Instead, he's focused on positioning himself where opportunity will find him. The city is vast, but his network is growing, one handshake and one unspoken agreement at a time. Paul's path into the Gambino ranks isn't a single dramatic leap. It's a slow, deliberate climb built on trust, family ties, and an unshakable sense of patience. By the early 1950s, New York's underworld is a layered machine, its gears turning in markets, construction sites, loading docks, and backroom offices. Paul knows that getting noticed in such a world is risky. The men who rise too fast often burn out just as quickly. Instead, he positions himself quietly, letting others talk while he listens, letting others take the spotlight while he builds something more durable. His first steps into deeper circles come through the meat distribution business. By then, he's already proven himself capable of keeping the family shop profitable, even under shifting market conditions. The skill hasn't gone unnoticed. Men connected to the Gambino family, then under the steady leadership of his cousin Carlo Gambino, see potential in him. Meat markets, after all, are more than just a source of food. They're hubs for controlling supply, setting prices, and deciding who gets what. That kind of control is invaluable to men who understand that business and influence are inseparable. Paul's work in distribution quickly teaches him how to blend legitimate business with quiet arrangements. He negotiates contracts with wholesalers, but he also knows when to let a delivery go missing, when to reroute a shipment to a preferred buyer, and when to extend credit to someone who might repay in favors rather than cash. None of these moves are rash. Each is calculated, designed to strengthen ties and deepen obligations. In the Gambino family, there's a hierarchy that outsiders rarely understand. Soldiers, captains, and underbosses operate like a corporate chain of command, but with consequences far more permanent than any boardroom dispute. Paul enters this world not as a brash newcomer, but as a man who already understands the value of discretion. His demeanor, calm, measured, and almost aloof, sets him apart from the younger men eager to prove themselves with loud gestures or reckless deals. It's around this time that Paul begins working under more seasoned figures, men who've been running crews for decades. They see in him a reliability that's rare, someone who can handle sensitive business without letting ego get in the way. He starts accompanying them to meetings, not speaking much, but absorbing every detail, the seating arrangements, the tone shifts, the way agreements are reached without a single word being written down. One evening, he finds himself in a dimly lit restaurant back room, sitting across from a seafood importer whose shipments have been arriving late. The conversation isn't hostile, but it's firm. The importer claims weather delays. Paul's associates suggest otherwise. Paul doesn't interrupt, but when the meeting ends, he walks the man to the door and offers a quiet piece of advice about rearranging his schedule to avoid such coincidences in the future. Weeks later, shipments begin arriving on time. No threats, no spectacle, just a subtle shift that everyone understands. Many people still think that this was the period where Paul's reputation as a problem solver solidified. He didn't need to shout, didn't need to flex muscle. He simply knew how to guide a situation to the outcome he wanted. Do you think that's what made him so effective later? Or was it his willingness to play the long game that truly set him apart? Carlo Gambino himself takes notice. As head of the family, Carlo prefers men who can keep the peace while making money, men who won't stir unnecessary trouble with other families. Paul fits this mold perfectly. He's offered more responsibility, overseeing certain aspects of the family's interests in the meat industry, and later, in construction. Both sectors are lucrative and full of opportunities for quiet control. Paul's rise isn't meteoric, but it's steady. He earns a reputation for being dependable and, just as importantly, predictable in the best way. No wild cards, no sudden betrayals, no unnecessary risks. Other captains may not fully trust each other, but they trust that Paul won't make moves without careful thought. The streets are full of men chasing quick scores, but Paul is building something slower, brick by brick. And in a world where one wrong move can erase years of work, that patience is a shield as strong as any muscle behind him. The concrete and steel of New York's post-war boom create opportunities far beyond the meat market. By the mid-1950s, Paul has begun stepping into the construction rackets, a realm where political influence, union control, and backroom deals intertwine to shape the city's skyline. It's a world that rewards those who can manage both men and money without letting one slip out of their grasp. Construction rackets aren't just about pouring foundations or laying bricks. They're about deciding which contractors get the bids, which unions get the labor, and which inspectors choose to look the other way. The Gambino family has long had its hands in this industry, and Carlo Gambino trusts Paul to help keep it profitable without attracting unnecessary heat. Paul's skill in this arena comes from the same principle he learned in the butcher shop: control the supply, and you control the outcome. In this case, the supply isn't meat. It's manpower and permits. He begins attending quiet meetings with union representatives in hotel lounges and dimly lit social clubs. Over cups of espresso or glasses of Chianti, deals are struck. A project might suddenly get delayed until a certain subcontractor is hired. A union might vote to change work rules in a way that favors a particular developer. Nothing is written down. Everything moves through whispers, nods, and envelopes. Paul learns the delicate art of negotiation in this setting. Sometimes, it's about offering a better price or a quicker timeline. Other times, it's about reminding someone of a favor owed or a problem that could be avoided. He never raises his voice, never resorts to open threats. Instead, he uses a steady tone and a patient stare, making it clear that his suggestions aren't optional. One of the biggest lessons comes during a dispute between two contractors over a major downtown project. The fight threatens to stall work for months, which would cost everyone money. Paul steps in quietly, arranging separate dinners with each man. He listens more than he speaks, identifies what each truly wants, and then crafts a solution that gives both enough to claim victory. Within a week, the project is back on track, and both contractors publicly thank each other. Neither mentions Paul, but both know who made it happen. This ability to broker peace while advancing his own position becomes a hallmark of Paul's style. Many people still think it was this skill, more than any muscle or intimidation, that made him indispensable in the Gambino operation. So what do you think? Was it diplomacy, or was it the calculated way he made others believe they were winning? The money from construction starts to flow steadily. Skimmed funds from inflated contracts find their way into discrete investments: restaurants, warehouses, small trucking companies. Paul understands the importance of diversifying, of having both legitimate and illegitimate sources of income. It's a lesson reinforced by older men in the family. The more legitimate you look, the harder it is for anyone to pull you down. His personal life mirrors his business approach: controlled, private, and free from unnecessary drama. While other men in the life flaunt their earnings in nightclubs and flashy cars, Paul prefers the comfort of well-tailored suits, fine meals at select restaurants, and evenings spent with trusted company. This choice makes him stand out. In a culture where power is often displayed loudly, Paul's restraint becomes its own kind of statement. By the late 1950s, his network has grown. Union leaders, contractors, suppliers, They all know his name, even if they never speak it outside certain rooms. The city is changing, and Paul is positioning himself to change with it. He doesn't need to dominate every racket. He just needs to control the ones that matter most to the family's stability and his own long-term security. And as the skyline rises, so does Paul, quietly, steadily, and without leaving fingerprints on the steel beams he's helped put in place. By the early 1960s, Paul Castellano's grip on New York's wholesale meat industry has tightened into something close to a monopoly. The lessons from his father's shop, combined with years of Gambino-backed influence, have positioned him as the gatekeeper for a product every restaurant, market, and hotel in the city needs. If you wanted prime cuts in bulk, odds were you'd have to go through a supply chain that, somewhere along the line, had Paul's fingerprints on it. The scheme works because it doesn't look like a scheme. Not at first. Meat is perishable. Demand is constant, and prices can be justified by the ebb and flow of supply. Paul understands that if you control the delivery schedules, the refrigeration facilities, and the distribution routes, you can make or break a buyer without ever appearing in the headlines. He doesn't threaten. He simply makes certain that those who deal with him get what they need, on time, in full, and at a quality others can't match. Those who don't, they experience sudden shortages that mysteriously never seem to affect their competitors. To the casual observer, he's just a successful businessman who happens to have deep ties to the city's food supply chain. To those inside the network, he's the man who decides how the meat moves. Union connections play a key role. Truckers, locals, cold storage workers, and market employees all operate within a hierarchy Paul has helped cultivate. If a driver wants the best routes, he knows whose name to keep in good standing. If a storage facility needs new equipment, the decision of who supplies it is made by people with Paul's number on speed dial. This control over the industry isn't just about money, it's about leverage. A restaurant owner who owes him for an emergency delivery is more likely to place bets with a certain bookmaker or to quietly host a private meeting in the back room for one of Paul's associates. A market manager who receives a favorable price is more inclined to vote a certain way in a union election. Every transaction builds a web of obligations. Many people still think it was this empire, more than his eventual title as boss, that made him untouchable for so long. What's your take? Was it the industry itself that insulated him, or the way he used it as a lever for influence far beyond meat? Despite his growing power, Paul keeps his public profile low. He doesn't mingle with celebrities, and he rarely attends events that could be splashed across the society pages. His Staten Island home is already becoming a symbol of his approach, grand in scale, private in nature. He prefers small dinners with trusted allies over loud banquets, and when he does appear in public, it's often in the company of family. Behind the scenes, however, he's expanding into related ventures. Refrigerated trucking companies, packaging plants, and even slaughterhouses begin to fall under his sphere of influence. Some of these acquisitions are made quietly, using trusted intermediaries. Others are done openly, giving him the veneer of a legitimate business mogul. One telling incident involves a chain of hotel restaurants facing a supply crisis after a competitor tries to undercut their contract. Paul intervenes, not with threats, but by offering a shipment at a price no one else can match. The hotels not only switch to his suppliers, but remain loyal for years, knowing that with Paul, reliability outweighs every other factor. The money is substantial. But what matters more is the stability it buys him within the Gambino family. Even the most hot-headed captains understand the value of an operation that brings in steady revenue. without generating the kind of attention law enforcement loves to chase. As long as the cash flows and the peace holds, Paul's position remains secure, and in an underworld that often feeds on chaos, Paul Castellano is proving that sometimes the surest way to win is to keep the game quiet and the stakes hidden from everyone but yourself. By the mid-1960s, Paul's image has evolved into something unusual for a mob figure. While others in the Gambino family lean into the archetype, dark suits, nightlife appearances, and a knack for being photographed in the right clubs, Paul takes a different approach. He cultivates an air of quiet wealth and deliberate privacy, earning him the nickname, the Howard Hughes of the Mafia, long before it would stick in the press. His days often begin early at his Staten Island estate, a sprawling, white-pillared home that feels more like a private retreat than the residence of one of New York's most influential underworld figures. Breakfast is a formal affair, even if it's just family at the table. Suits are pressed, shoes shined, and newspapers laid out in neat stacks. Wall Street reports beside the day's headlines. From there, his schedule balances legitimate business meetings with carefully orchestrated underworld transactions. To those who know him personally, Paul's reclusive tendencies are more strategy than personality quirk. He prefers to let his captains and trusted lieutenants handle street-level disputes, keeping his own name and face out of day-to-day operations. This distance gives him a dual advantage. It minimizes his exposure to law enforcement and makes him seem almost untouchable within the organization. When he does attend meetings, he often hosts them at his home, where the setting is controlled and the atmosphere subtly asserts his status. Guests pass manicured lawns, fountains, and guarded gates before stepping into rooms filled with fine art and heavy wood furniture. The message is clear. They are not meeting in a back room or a smoke-filled social club. They are stepping into the private world of a man who sees himself as more than just a mobster. Paul's interest in business extends beyond the rackets. He follows real estate trends, invests in small but profitable companies, and keeps an eye on political developments that could shift the city's economic balance. To him, power isn't about the number of soldiers under his command. It's about leverage in sectors that influence everyday life. The meat industry remains his cornerstone, but he quietly expands into trucking, food distribution, and even some construction contracts, always through intermediaries to keep his name at arm's length. Many people still think that his measured, almost corporate style was his greatest strength. It's what made him seem more like a CEO than a street boss. But others argue it isolated him from the street, eroding the loyalty of men who valued personal presence over financial cunning. Which side do you lean toward? Was Paul's distance a sign of sophistication, or a fatal flaw in a business where face-to-face loyalty often decides survival? While Paul's inner circle appreciates his steady leadership, the contrast between his style and that of more flamboyant mobsters doesn't go unnoticed. Men like John Gotti, then still climbing the ranks, thrive on visibility and swagger. Paul's quiet wealth and preference for seclusion create an image that to some borders on arrogance. He is respected, but he is also seen as aloof, an image that will one day play into tensions within the family. Even so, the 1960s are largely smooth for Paul. His enterprises grow steadily, his alliances hold firm, and law enforcement's attention tends to focus on flashier figures. He understands that avoiding the limelight is a skill, one that requires turning down certain deals, keeping volatile personalities at arm's length, and, when necessary, overpaying to keep peace. And while the city around him buzzes with noise, Paul continues to build his empire in near silence, the foundations reinforced by every handshake every favor and every quiet dinner behind guarded gates, the Staten Island estate becomes more than Paul Castellano's residence. It's his fortress, his boardroom, and his personal symbol of control. By the early 1970s, the mansion's white columns and perfectly trimmed hedges are as much a part of his identity as his tailored suits. Locals call it the White House, not only for its appearance, but for the way it operates. As the center of decisions that ripple far beyond its gates, inside, the atmosphere is deliberate. The air is faintly scented with expensive cigars and polished wood. Every room feels purposeful, from the formal dining hall used for hosting select guests to the smaller, more private study where the most delicate conversations take place. Visitors are made to feel the weight of the setting before a single word is exchanged. They know that here, Paul sets the tone. The home's security is discreet but thorough. Guards are never ostentatious, but their presence is unmistakable to anyone paying attention. Vehicles approaching the estate are observed before entry. Meetings are scheduled, never spontaneous. Even family visits follow an order that reflects Paul's insistence on discipline. This isn't paranoia, it's procedure. A lesson he's carried from decades of watching how quickly opportunity can turn into exposure. In the White House, Paul blends business and personal life with careful precision. A dinner might start with discussions about family milestones and end with quiet talks about union elections or supply chain adjustments. Paul prefers to keep meetings on his turf because here he controls the variables, the seating, the privacy, and even the way a guest leaves, through the front with a handshake or out a side door with no announcement. Some of his captains thrive in this environment, appreciating the clarity and order it brings. Others find it stifling, a far cry from the smoky social clubs where men swap stories and make deals over a hand of cards. Many people still think this physical and symbolic separation is what began to drive a wedge between Paul and the street-level soldiers. What do you think? Was the White House a sign of strength? Or did it create a wall between him and the men whose loyalty he needed most? From the estate, Paul oversees his expanding portfolio. Legitimate businesses continue to serve as both income streams and buffers against scrutiny. His wholesale meat operations remain dominant, but he's increasingly involved in construction contracts, using his network to steer lucrative deals toward allies. The trucking industry, too, falls deeper under his influence, particularly in sectors where refrigerated transport is essential. Paul's family life at the estate is equally structured. Meals are shared, traditions maintained, and appearances kept immaculate. His wife, Nina, keeps the household running with the same quiet efficiency that Paul demands in business. Children and grandchildren grow up in an environment that feels worlds apart from the Brooklyn streets where Paul began. Yet even here, the code of loyalty and discretion is woven into daily life. Occasionally, Paul opens the estate to larger gatherings, especially when marking significant events within the family or business. These occasions are more formal than festive, with fine dining and polite conversation replacing loud music or drunken boasts. Deals are hinted at, alliances reaffirmed, and rivalries subtly addressed without a single raised voice. Outside the gates, law enforcement keeps a quiet watch. Agents know the White House is a hub, but gaining access or evidence is another matter. They photograph guests, track license plates, and build files. But Paul's disciplined approach leaves them with little more than patterns and speculation. And so the mansion stands, serene on the surface, its white walls hiding the calculations and decisions that keep Paul Castellano at the center of a web stretching through unions, industries, and neighborhoods. A fortress not just of brick and stone, but of order, patience, and the belief that control begins at home. Quiet wealth has a way of drawing its own kind of attention. By the mid-1970s, Paul Castellano's name is known well enough in New York business circles that even those with no ties to the underworld have heard of him. They may not know exactly what he does, but they know he has influence, steady, subtle, and far-reaching. His approach to wealth is calculated. He doesn't flash it in nightclubs or casinos. Instead, he surrounds himself with the kind of luxuries that are meant to be enjoyed privately. The estate is filled with fine Italian furniture. Tailored suits line his closets, and the wine cellar holds bottles selected with the same care he applies to business decisions. When Paul invests, it's rarely impulsive. He prefers ventures that complement his existing empire, transport, distribution, or anything connected to the supply chains he already controls. He understands that visible restraint can make a man appear more powerful than open extravagance. While some captains roll through Little Italy in brand new Cadillacs, Paul's car is immaculate but understated. His jewelry is minimal, his watches chosen for function and craft rather than sparkle. In the circles where his opinion matters, this quiet style speaks volumes. It says he doesn't need to prove his wealth to anyone. Still, there's a balance to maintain. Appear too humble, and people might think you're weak. Show too much, and you invite envy or attention from law enforcement. Paul walks that line with care. He'll host an elegant dinner where the cutlery alone is worth more than a used car, but the guest list is selective, and the conversation never drifts toward anything that would look suspicious in a police report. Many people still think this cultivated image was part of what allowed him to operate as long as he did without the same level of heat others attracted. But some argue it was a double-edged sword, creating distance from the street soldiers who valued a boss they could see enjoying the same spoils they risked their lives for. Which side do you take? The late 70s are a prosperous period for Paul's operations. His control over the meat industry remains firm, and his reach into construction and trucking continues to expand. Legitimate business earnings are carefully balanced with cash from less formal ventures, each reinforcing the other. His captains appreciate the consistent flow of money, but some of the younger, more ambitious men are restless. They want more action, more visibility, and in some cases, more of the spoils redirected their way. Paul's response to such restlessness is always the same. He listens, nods, and then makes decisions based on the long-term stability of the family. He's not swayed by emotion or bravado. If a man has proven himself useful and loyal, Paul will ensure he's taken care of. If someone pushes too far, too quickly, they find themselves sidelined, sometimes permanently, but more often in ways that let them save face while being quietly removed from positions of influence. Beyond the walls of his estate, the city is shifting. Economic challenges, rising crime, and political upheavals are reshaping New York's landscape. For Paul, this is opportunity disguised as chaos. Industries in trouble can be bought cheap. Struggling businesses are more open to partnerships, especially with someone who can guarantee steady supply lines or labor peace. And through it all, Paul Castellano maintains the same steady rhythm. Measured decisions, minimal exposure, and the belief that true power doesn't need to be loud. It only needs to be felt. Paul Castellano's connection to Carlo Gambino is more than a shared bloodline. It's a bridge that carries him from being a powerful earner to someone whose voice carries weight at the very top of the Mafia hierarchy. By the late 1970s, Carlo is in the twilight of his reign as boss, and his methodical style mirrors Paul's own approach. Both men value business acumen over showmanship, diplomacy over reckless violence. The two share more than strategy. They share trust. Carlo understands that Paul's dominance in the wholesale meat industry, construction rackets, and trucking unions makes him not just wealthy, but essential. Control over industries that touch nearly every restaurant, hotel, and worksite in New York is worth more than any single gambling or loan sharking operation. And Paul's reach in these areas isn't built on chance. It's built on relationships Carlo has watched him nurture for decades. Their meetings are rarely dramatic. Often, Paul visits Carlo's modest home in Brooklyn rather than hosting at the estate. They talk over coffee, discussing shifts in union leadership, the latest whispers from the commission, and the constant balancing act of keeping peace among the 5 families. Carlo values Paul's ability to assess a problem without immediately resorting to force. In a world where grudges can turn bloody overnight, that restraint is a rare asset. It's during these years that Paul begins acting as an informal advisor on matters that stretch beyond his direct business interests. Carlo asks his opinion on proposed alliances, potential expansions, and how best to handle ambitious younger capos whose patience is wearing thin. Paul offers careful, considered responses, never telling Carlo what he should do, but presenting the outcomes each choice might bring. Many people still think that this mentorship, more than any single business deal, positioned Paul as Carlo's eventual successor. Others argue that it also painted a target on his back, as men who had their own ambitions began to see him as the chosen heir. What's your take? Was this trust a blessing, or the first step toward inevitable conflict? Even with his growing influence, Paul doesn't try to overshadow Carlo. He attends commission meetings as needed, but always as a representative, never as the loudest voice in the room. In these gatherings, where bosses and underbosses from across the city exchange updates and warnings, Paul plays the role of the calm observer. He speaks only when his input can shift the room's direction. Outside of formal Mafia politics, the two men's bond is reinforced by family gatherings, weddings, and quiet dinners that remind everyone the Gambino organization is as much a family in blood as it is in name. To outsiders, Paul's role might still seem secondary. To those inside, it's clear that he is being groomed for something more. Carlo's health begins to waver, and Paul steps in to handle more of the daily decisions. His style doesn't change, still private, still methodical, but the scope of his authority widens. He uses the opportunity to solidify control over his territories, ensuring that when the time comes, he'll inherit not just a title, but a well-maintained network. In an underworld where leadership changes often come through violence, Paul's rise under Carlo's wing is unusually smooth, and for the moment, that smoothness feels like security. But in the shadows, the men who thrive on turbulence are already waiting for their chance to stir the waters. When Carlo Gambino dies in 1976, the transition of power is anything but accidental. In a move that surprises some and angers others, Paul Castellano is named boss of the Gambino family. The decision bypasses several senior figures, including underboss Agnello Della Croce, a man respected by the street soldiers and feared by rivals. To those who know Carlo's preferences, the choice makes sense. Paul embodies Carlo's vision of a business-first mafia, one that favors steady profit over unpredictable street wars. But the underworld isn't a corporate boardroom, and not everyone appreciates being passed over. Della Croce, a man steeped in traditional mob values and deeply connected to the street, swallows the decision publicly. He pledges loyalty to Paul, but privately, he remains the focal point for soldiers who see Castellano as too distant, too polished, too insulated in his Staten Island fortress. Paul steps into the role with the same calculated precision he's always shown. His first order of business is maintaining stability. He reassures captains that their operations will continue without interference, provided they keep the peace and the money flowing. He strengthens ties to unions, cements construction rackets, and keeps the wholesale meat business running like clockwork. His leadership style mirrors a corporate CEO's: clear divisions of responsibility, limited personal appearances, and a preference for handling disputes quietly. For Paul, the boss's job isn't to micromanage every gambling den or loan operation. It's to oversee the larger picture, ensuring the family's business portfolio grows without drawing the kind of law enforcement scrutiny that could bring it all down. Still, he understands the optics. Many soldiers equate leadership with visibility, and Paul's preference for conducting business from his home or private offices fuels a perception problem. He tries to bridge the gap by attending select social gatherings and making calculated appearances in Little Italy. But these visits are rare. His world is built on predictability and control. Two things the street rarely offers. One early test of his leadership comes when a dispute over gambling territory threatens to pit two captains against each other. Rather than call a meeting in a public setting, Paul invites both to his estate. Over a dinner that feels more like a negotiation between business executives than mobsters, he guides them toward a resolution that leaves both satisfied while subtly increasing their dependence on his approval for future decisions. Many people still think that this period, right after Carlo's death, was Paul at his strongest, with the family united under a vision of quiet profit. Others argue it was the beginning of the divide that would eventually undo him. Do you think his approach was smart leadership? Or was he ignoring the need for a boss to be more than a distant figurehead? Law enforcement takes note of the seamless transition. FBI agents, accustomed to chaos after a Mafia boss's death, watch with frustration as the Gambino family operates without missing a beat. They know Paul is the man at the top, but his low profile makes gathering evidence difficult. Surveillance photos show him entering and leaving his home, but rarely engaging in anything overtly incriminating. For Paul, the lack of headlines is a sign he's doing things right. In a world where visibility often equals vulnerability, he's content to let the street-level guys be the face of the business, while he remains the mind guiding it all from behind closed doors. Paul Castellano's rules for running the Gambino family are clear, and they carry the weight of both expectation and consequence. Violence, in his view, is a tool of last resort, not the first move in a dispute. He prefers to settle conflicts through negotiation, compromise, and the quiet application of pressure, methods that minimize exposure and keep the cash flowing. This approach appeals to some captains, especially those who profit from steady business rather than high-risk ventures. But to the soldiers who thrive on action, Paul's leadership feels rigid, even sterile. His code of conduct extends beyond the business. Paul discourages drug trafficking within the family, warning that the quick profits aren't worth the heat it brings from law enforcement. He believes in diversifying into industries that can be masked as legitimate: construction, trucking, food distribution, and he demands that those who operate under his banner follow the same philosophy. Breaking these rules isn't just a violation of trust, it's a challenge to the system he's built. Paul's meetings reflect his obsession with order. At his estate, he prefers small gatherings where every participant's role is defined. Seating is deliberate, discussions are direct, and decisions are recorded mentally, not on paper. The tone is closer to that of a boardroom than a backroom club. Captains leave with clear instructions, knowing there's little room for improvisation once Paul has made up his mind. One of his most significant initiatives as boss is expanding the family's influence in labor unions. By leveraging connections in the International Brotherhood of Teamsters and other key locals, Paul ensures that construction projects, shipping schedules, and even certain municipal contracts move according to his approval. The strategy is elegant. If you can control when and how goods move, you can control almost everything. This tight grip on logistics extends his reach beyond New York. Deals with allies in other cities give him influence over shipments in and out of ports along the East Coast. A meat shipment in Philadelphia or a trucking contract in Boston might not bear his name, but somewhere in the chain, one of his people is making sure it benefits his operation. Many people still think his discipline was his greatest strength, keeping the family profitable and mostly out of open conflict. But there's a counterpoint, that such discipline bred resentment among those who saw the rules as suffocating. Which way do you see it? Protective guardrails or a chokehold on ambition? Paul's public demeanor mirrors his private philosophy. He rarely raises his voice, never appears hurried, and maintains a calm that can unnerve even seasoned associates. When someone brings him a problem, he listens fully before responding. Often, his solution is delivered in measured tones, with the kind of certainty that leaves no room for debate. Still, cracks begin to appear. Younger members of the family, eager for faster money and bigger risks, chafe under his restrictions, especially the drug ban. They see other families reaping huge profits from narcotics, while Paul's men are told to stick to construction scams, labor rackets, and long-game investments. To them, his way feels outdated, too focused on slow returns in a city that's changing fast. But Paul remains convinced that his method is the one that will keep the Gambino family at the top without drawing the kind of attention that topples empires. And for now, the machine runs smoothly, built on rules, reinforced by discipline, and powered by a boss who believes control is the ultimate currency. Paul Castellano's philosophy, business over blood, becomes the defining principle of his reign. In his mind, the true power of the Gambino family lies not in shootouts or street corners, but in the steady hum of legitimate-looking enterprises that feed a constant stream of cash into the organization. Violence to Paul is messy, unpredictable, and almost always bad for business. This belief doesn't mean he's naive about the world he's in. He knows there are times when force is necessary, but he treats those instances as rare exceptions, carried out with precision and without spectacle. More often, his method of handling disputes involves bringing the parties together in a neutral setting, often his estate, where the conversation feels like corporate arbitration rather than mob mediation. If someone leaves unhappy, they do so quietly, aware that pushing the issue further could result in more than just a lost deal. His aversion to unnecessary bloodshed is partly strategic. Paul understands that the fewer bodies that drop, the less attention law enforcement will give to his operations. Murders invite headlines, and headlines invite investigations. Instead, he channels the family's energy into rackets that can be disguised as above-board business: labor union control, construction contracts, food distribution monopolies, and trucking routes. These ventures not only generate reliable income, but also make the Gambino presence harder to detect. Many people still think this approach reflected a shrewd understanding of modern organized crime, a pivot from the brute force of earlier decades to a model that could survive under the increasing pressure of federal investigations. Others see it as a gamble that alienated the family's street soldiers, who thrived on the old ways and felt sidelined by a boss who seemed more interested in boardrooms than back alleys. Which side do you lean toward? Paul's focus on profit extends to how he evaluates his capos. A captain who keeps his territory peaceful and profitable earns Paul's favor. One who stirs trouble, even if he brings in money, risks losing his position. This merit system, if it can be called that, rewards those who adapt to his style and punishes those who cling to the more chaotic methods of the past. An example comes when two crews in Brooklyn clash over control of a warehouse district. Rather than letting the conflict spiral, Paul intervenes by reorganizing their operations entirely. One crew is shifted toward construction contracts, the other toward trucking logistics, with both still reporting healthy earnings to the top. The street tension dissolves, not because Paul made a dramatic show of force, but because he restructured the playing field to eliminate the cause of the conflict. His way of thinking mirrors the corporate world so closely that some within the family joke, quietly, that he should have been running a Fortune 500 company instead of the largest Mafia family in the country. But the results are hard to argue with. Under Paul's leadership, the Gambino organization grows richer and more entrenched in legitimate industries than ever before. Still, not everyone is satisfied. Younger, more ambitious members see Paul's restraint as a barrier to quick riches. They chafe at the idea of turning down lucrative drug deals, especially when other families are raking in cash from narcotics. Paul's refusal to bend on this point deepens the divide between his boardroom vision and the street's appetite for high-risk, high-reward ventures. And while Paul believes he's building an empire that can endure, the very discipline he prizes is slowly becoming the wedge that threatens to split the family from within. For Paul Castellano, the Mafia Commission is both an arena of opportunity and a minefield. Sitting at the table with the heads of New York's other powerful families means navigating egos, histories, and unspoken rules that carry as much weight as any written law. As boss of the Gambino family, the largest of the five, Paul's voice is one of the most influential in the room. But influence here isn't about speaking the loudest. It's about knowing when to speak at all. The commission exists to prevent open warfare, mediate disputes, and coordinate ventures that touch multiple families. In theory, it's a stabilizing force. In practice, it's a delicate balancing act, with each boss weighing the benefits of cooperation against the temptation to push their own agenda. Paul approaches these meetings the same way he handles his own family, like a CEO managing a coalition of major shareholders. He arrives prepared, aware of every major deal in motion, every shift in union leadership, every federal investigation brewing. He prefers to steer conversations toward business that benefits everyone: construction contracts, shared control of certain unions, long-term investments that can be shielded from law enforcement. In doing so, he reinforces his own philosophy. Keep the money steady. Keep the headlines away. Still, these gatherings are not without tension. Bosses from more aggressive backgrounds sometimes view Paul's reserved corporate style as out of step with the street-driven culture that built the commission in the first place. They want faster moves, bigger risks, and they're less inclined to forego a profitable venture just because it might invite extra heat. Paul, in turn, sees them as reckless. a danger not just to themselves, but to the stability of the entire underworld. One heated debate centers on narcotics. Paul reaffirms his long-standing ban, warning that drug cases bring longer prison sentences, more motivated prosecutors, and greater federal resources. "It's a bell you can't unring," he tells the room. Some nod in agreement. Others remain silent, knowing they'll continue their drug operations regardless. Many people still think this was one of Paul's most defining stances, one that kept his organization cleaner in the short term, but deepened rifts with captains who saw the drug trade as their ticket to fortune. Do you think the ban was foresight or stubbornness? Outside the formal meetings, Paul uses his position on the commission to secure alliances. By offering Gambino influence in unions or markets outside New York, he builds reciprocal arrangements in other cities. A West Coast contact might ensure favorable treatment for Gambino-connected trucking companies, while a Midwest ally might open doors in meat distribution channels. These deals are rarely written, but they're enforced by the shared understanding that crossing such agreements has consequences. Within his own family, Paul uses the commission as leverage. Being able to say, "The commission supports this," or "The other families have agreed," adds weight to his directives. It turns personal decisions into collective mandates, making it harder for dissenters to claim he's acting purely in his own interest. Yet the very same table that solidifies Paul's power also exposes him to the ambitions of others. Some bosses admire his restraint, others quietly resent it. And in a world where alliances can shift overnight, respect can turn into rivalry without warning. For now, though, Paul sits comfortably at the commission's table, measured, composed, and quietly shaping the direction of the American Mafia from a seat that few ever occupy, and even fewer manage to hold for long. The tension between Paul Castellano and John Gotti begins quietly, almost imperceptibly, like a hairline crack in glass that eventually spreads. At first, Gotti is just another ambitious capo under Agnello Della Croce, running a crew out of Queens with a reputation for making money and handling problems swiftly, sometimes too swiftly for Paul's taste. Gotti's style is everything Paul's is not: loud, public, and laced with the kind of swagger that draws both admiration and attention from law enforcement. Paul notices Gotti early and not always favorably. He respects the man's ability to generate income, but he also sees the trail of noise it leaves behind. Gambling operations, loans, and muscle work all have their place, but the FBI surveillance vans that seem to circle Gotti's haunts are a liability Paul would rather not inherit. The friction grows over differences in philosophy. Paul demands that all operations, especially high-risk ones, be cleared through the top. Gotti prefers to move fast and ask forgiveness later, if at all. Paul's ban on narcotics is another sticking point. Rumors begin to circulate that Gotti's crew is dabbling in drug distribution despite the rule. If true, it's not just disobedience. It's a direct challenge to the kind of family Paul is trying to run. In public, both men keep things civil. In private, Paul voices his concerns to Della Croce, reminding him that loyalty means following the rules set at the top. Della Croce, caught between his loyalty to Paul as boss and his loyalty to Gotti as a trusted protege, works to keep the peace. But peace in the Gambino family is becoming a balancing act, and the scales are shifting. Many people still think this was the beginning of the end, the moment when Paul's corporate model collided with the street's hunger for flash and fast money. What's your take? Could they have coexisted? Or was one destined to push the other out? Paul tries to keep his focus on the broader picture, He's still expanding the family's reach in unions and construction, still building alliances through the commission, still keeping the law at a manageable distance. But he's not blind to the undercurrent. Younger members whisper about Gotti's boldness, his willingness to confront rivals directly, his generosity when it comes to spreading cash among his crew. In the street's eyes, those are marks of a leader. The difference in style becomes especially clear at social events, where Paul might arrive quietly, exchange a few polite words, and leave before dessert. Gotti holds court, laughing loudly, surrounded by admirers. To Paul, this is recklessness. To others, it's charisma. And charisma has a way of building loyalty that rules and structure sometimes can't match. Still, Paul believes discipline will prevail. He's convinced that the long game, steady profit, minimal exposure, will outlast any short-term gains from high-profile street moves. What he doesn't fully account for is how quickly loyalty can shift when money and excitement pull in a different direction. The DeMeo crew is one of the darker shadows in Paul Castellano's reign, a crew that operates on the fringe between business necessity and moral hazard. Led by Roy DeMeo out of Brooklyn, the crew's reputation for violence is as notorious as its knack for making money. Officially, Paul champions a vision of the Gambino family as a business-first organization. Unofficially, he understands that certain operations, especially those that enforce control, require men who can get their hands dirty without hesitation. The DeMeo crew runs various scams: auto theft rings, loan sharking, pornography distribution, and contract killings. They are specialists in making problems disappear, both in the figurative sense and, more chillingly, the literal one. Roy DeMeo's methods are brutal but effective, and his loyalty to Castellano is rooted in the protection and latitude Paul grants him. Paul's relationship with DeMeo is complicated. On one hand, the crew's earnings are substantial, and their ability to neutralize threats quickly is a form of insurance. On the other, their notoriety is a constant risk. Stories leak out of their work, some exaggerated, some all too real, and law enforcement pressure builds around them. Paul tolerates the situation because he believes he can keep it contained. Meetings with DeMeo are carefully managed, with discussions framed in terms of business problems rather than explicit crimes. The crew's activities inevitably brush against Paul's rules. Their willingness to use violence preemptively doesn't align with his philosophy of restraint. Yet he also knows that removing them outright could create a vacuum that other, less controllable crews might fill. So, he walks a fine line, using DeMeo's muscle when necessary, but keeping them at arm's length whenever possible. Many people still think this was a calculated risk Paul took willingly, betting that the crew's usefulness outweighed the danger of association. Others see it as a blind spot, proof that even the most disciplined boss can be drawn into alliances that contradict his own code. Which side seems more convincing to you? One incident illustrates the paradox perfectly. A rival in a union dispute refuses to budge, despite polite warnings. Within weeks, the problem vanishes, quietly, permanently. Paul doesn't ask for details, and none are offered. The contract shifts in his favor, revenue increases, and on the surface, the matter ends there. But in the background, detectives begin to connect dots that lead back toward DeMeo's crew, creating a trail that, while faint, is enough to put more eyes on Castellano himself. Paul understands the danger of letting such stories circulate. He begins tightening the leash, instructing intermediaries to rein in DeMeo's most visible activities. But by this point, the crew's reputation has taken on a life of its own. Fear and fascination follow them, and both have a way of attracting attention. exactly the kind Paul has spent a career avoiding. The uneasy alliance continues, each side aware that they benefit from the other, yet wary of the costs. For Paul, it's another reminder that in the world he rules, even the cleanest business plan is never entirely free from the mess of the street. By the early 1980s, the calm Paul Castellano has worked so carefully to maintain begins to feel less like security and more like a countdown. Federal investigators, once content to watch from the shadows, are stepping closer. Surveillance operations grow more sophisticated, with hidden microphones in restaurants, bugged offices, and even wired informants embedded in familiar circles. Paul knows he's being watched. It's the reality of the position. But the scope of the attention is starting to shift. Law enforcement has learned that chasing low-level arrests rarely dents the leadership of an organized crime family. Now, the focus is on building long-term cases, ones that use months, even years of surveillance to stack charges that can't be easily dodged. This means Paul's own words, once safely confined to private rooms, can become evidence if spoken in the wrong place. Paul responds with tighter operational discipline. Meetings are moved from public venues to the controlled privacy of his Staten Island estate. Sensitive topics are avoided entirely, unless face-to-face with trusted confidants. Conversations are layered in vague language, where supplies might mean contracts, and arrangements could mean anything from shipping schedules to the settlement of disputes. But even with such precautions, the pressure is mounting. In 1981, the FBI intensifies its presence in the wholesale meat industry, citing antitrust concerns and labor violations. Publicly, the cases are framed as standard business investigations. Privately, Paul knows they're aimed at him. Agents trail delivery trucks, interview union officials, and subpoena records from companies tied to his network. Many people still think this period marked the first real cracks in the armor Paul had built over decades. His strategy of blending legitimate business with underworld control relied on staying one step ahead of scrutiny. Now, the scrutiny isn't just closer, it's systematic. Do you think a boss can adapt to that kind of persistent watch? Or is it only a matter of time before something slips? Adding to the tension, other families are also under federal siege, making commission politics more volatile. A single arrest or indictment in one family can shift alliances, and Paul must navigate the possibility that a desperate ally might trade information to save himself. Trust, always a precious commodity in his world, becomes even harder to maintain. His captains sense the tightening net. Some grow more cautious, scaling back operations to avoid heat. Others push harder, hoping to grab what they can before the hammer falls. Paul tries to hold the line, reminding them that panic and greed are the surest ways to invite disaster. And yet, even as the threat grows, his outer composure never wavers. At the White House, dinners are served on time, the lawns are perfectly manicured, and business continues in its measured, deliberate rhythm. If there's fear, Paul keeps it locked behind the same calm expression he's worn since the butcher shop days, aware that in a world built on perception, the moment you look cornered is the moment you start to lose. Wiretaps are the quiet killers of Paul Castellano's world. Unlike the headline-grabbing arrests of street soldiers, they work in silence, collecting fragments of conversation day after day until there's enough to draw a net around the target. By 1983, the FBI has become skilled at placing them in places Paul once thought untouchable: business offices, meeting spots, and the phones of trusted associates. The bugs don't just capture deals. They capture tone, intent, and the subtle language Paul relies on to keep his business insulated. For decades, coded talk has been his shield, never naming names, never stating specifics. But technology is advancing, and investigators are getting better at connecting the dots. A casual reference to those packages can be linked to a shipment. An offhand mention of that situation can be tied to a dispute resolved in someone's favor. The most damaging breach comes when law enforcement plants a listening device inside the office of the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club in Queens, a stronghold tied to John Gotti's crew. The recordings capture conversations about drug trafficking, kickbacks, and disputes, all of which run counter to Paul's rules and image. Even though he's not the one saying the words, the fact that such activity happens under his leadership threatens his authority. Paul reacts with increased caution. He limits calls, avoids certain meeting spots, and insists on in-person talks whenever possible. Associates accustomed to conducting business over the phone find themselves making more trips to Staten Island, where the setting is under Paul's control. His message is consistent. The fewer words spoken in the wrong place, the safer everyone is. Yet there's a paradox here. The more cautious Paul becomes, the more his captains feel the distance between him and the day-to-day life of the family. Some interpret his isolation as fear. Others see it as arrogance. Many people still think this growing separation was one of the main factors that weakened his grip. What's your read? Was it smart defense? Or the slow erosion of a boss's connection to his own men? Meanwhile, prosecutors begin stitching the wiretap transcripts into larger cases. Labor racketeering, extortion, and bid rigging are threaded together into a picture of systemic control. Even when Paul's name isn't spoken directly, the pattern points upward. One incident strikes particularly close. A meeting between two union officials, recorded without their knowledge, includes a veiled reference to the boss up in Staten Island. It's vague enough to avoid immediate charges, but specific enough to give the FBI confidence they're closing in. Paul doesn't panic, at least not outwardly. Instead, he doubles down on the habits that have kept him safe for decades: discipline, discretion, and the belief that in this world, those who speak least often last longest. But for the first time in years, the walls around him feel like they're holding back more than just the outside world. They're holding in a storm that's building with every recorded word. The wholesale meat trial becomes a public test of Paul Castellano's ability to keep his empire looking legitimate. By 1984, federal prosecutors have compiled a case alleging that Paul and several associates manipulated prices, controlled distribution routes, and used union muscle to pressure competitors out of the market. For most business owners, such charges would be career-ending. For Paul, they threaten the very foundation of his low-profile strategy. The trial is the result of years of investigation, grand jury subpoenas, informant testimonies, and, most damaging of all, internal business records seized from companies linked to Paul's network. These documents don't have his signature, but they reveal patterns. Contracts consistently awarded to firms tied to his allies, competitors suddenly losing their labor force to scheduling conflicts, and delivery trucks rerouted under suspicious circumstances. Paul's defense team frames it as aggressive but legal business competition, painting him as a successful entrepreneur being targeted because of his last name. In court, he sits calm and composed, dressed in conservative suits, speaking only when required. The goal is to project an image far removed from the street violence most people associate with organized crime. Still, the trial exposes details that make headlines. Reporters seize on testimony from union officials describing arrangements that sound less like normal negotiation and more like quiet coercion. Prosecutors lean into these moments, hinting at a broader network of influence without fully naming it. The word Gambino is used sparingly, but the association hangs in the air. Many people still think this trial marked a shift in how the public saw Paul. No longer just a mysterious figure in a mansion, but a businessman whose success was built on something more than market savvy. Do you think such public exposure helps dismantle a boss's mystique? Or can it sometimes enhance it in certain circles? Inside the Gambino family, reactions are mixed. Some see Paul's composure as proof of his strength under pressure. Others worry that the trial, win or lose, gives law enforcement more reason to focus on their operations. Even without a conviction, the publicity is enough to tighten the spotlight on every business connected to him. Paul ultimately avoids prison time from the case, but the victory is narrow. The experience reinforces his belief in keeping an even greater distance between himself and anything that might be construed as direct criminal activity. He increases the use of intermediaries, delegates more operational control to trusted captains, and spends even more time at the estate. The trial also leaves him with a sharper understanding of the federal strategy. They're no longer trying to catch mob bosses in the act. They're building webs of circumstantial evidence, tying legitimate ventures to underworld influence until the picture becomes undeniable to a jury. It's a methodical approach, and Paul knows it won't stop with him. For the moment, he's free. The meat empire still intact. But the quiet comfort of Staten Island feels a little less secure now. The fences around his world, not quite as high as they once seemed. Atlantic City in the early 1980s is a place where fortunes can be made overnight and lost just as fast. Since New Jersey legalized casino gambling in 1976, the seaside resort town has transformed into a glittering strip of neon lights and high-stakes tables. For the Mafia, it's a new frontier, one that blends the steady profits of labor rackets with the volatility of the gaming industry. Paul Castellano sees opportunity, but he also sees risk. The control of construction contracts, union labor, and supply chains feeding the casinos is where the real money lies, not at the roulette wheel or the blackjack table. Paul's strategy is to insert the Gambino family into the infrastructure of Atlantic City's boom. That means controlling who builds, who delivers, and who maintains the hotels, restaurants, and entertainment venues sprouting along the boardwalk. But Atlantic City is already a crowded playing field. The Genovese, Bruno, and Philadelphia crime families each have deep roots in the region, and none are eager to give up territory. Negotiations between families are tense, with each side seeking to secure contracts without sparking a war. Paul favors a diplomatic approach, advocating for clear boundaries and profit-sharing arrangements that minimize conflict. Not everyone agrees. Some captains, especially those with more aggressive instincts, argue for a harder push. They see the casino floors themselves as untapped gold mines, places to plant skimming operations, manipulate junket deals, and run high-interest loan sharking schemes directly to gamblers. Paul resists, knowing that casino revenue is tightly monitored by state regulators and that the FBI has already begun infiltrating the industry. Many people still think Paul's caution in Atlantic City was a missed opportunity, a sign he was too conservative to seize a truly lucrative market. Others believe it was foresight, avoiding a quagmire that later brought indictments to those who dove in too deep. Which side makes more sense to you? One flashpoint comes when a construction contract for a major casino expansion becomes available. Two different families lay claim to it, and tensions rise fast. Paul steps in as mediator, using his commission connections to broker a compromise. The work will be split, with each side taking a defined share of the labor and material supply chain. It's not a perfect solution. Some grumble about losing potential profit, but it prevents a dispute from escalating into violence that could jeopardize every family's Atlantic City interests. Behind the scenes, Paul quietly strengthens his position by locking up contracts for food and beverage supply to casino restaurants, using the same distribution networks he controls in New York. Refrigerated trucks that once carried meat exclusively for New York clients now make regular runs to the Jersey Shore. The profits aren't as flashy as a casino skim, but they're steady, and they come without the same law enforcement attention. Still, the Atlantic City experience leaves a lingering unease among certain Gambino factions. Some of the younger and more ambitious members see Paul's careful, limited involvement as a sign that he's out of touch with the new ways to make fast money. And once that idea takes hold, it's not easily shaken. By the mid-1980s, the carefully built order inside the Gambino family is beginning to show strain. Beneath the polished structure Paul Castellano has imposed, small fractures are forming. Fractures caused by money, ambition, and resentment. His corporate approach to leadership has kept the family profitable, but it has also left many street-level soldiers feeling disconnected from the man at the top. The resentment isn't just about Paul's distance, it's about perception. To the men hustling in social clubs, running numbers, and collecting envelopes, Paul's world of steakhouse dinners, manicured lawns, and quiet meetings in the White House feels more like an executive suite than a street boss's headquarters. They don't see him walking their neighborhoods, shaking hands, or standing in the same smoky back rooms where their fathers and uncles once met the boss. Tensions sharpen when certain captains begin to suspect they're being shorted on profit shares. Paul's accounting is deliberate and tightly controlled, but in a culture built on trust and face-to-face loyalty, numbers alone aren't always enough to keep suspicions at bay. Whispers start that the boss takes too much off the top, that he favors his close-knit circle over the men who take the daily risks. Adding to the unrest is the slow but steady encroachment of narcotics into the family's operations. Paul's ban on drug dealing remains firm, but enforcement is another matter. Crews like John Gotti's are rumored to be making serious money in heroin and cocaine despite the rules. Each time Paul hears such rumors, he faces a dilemma. Enforce the ban strictly and risk alienating powerful earners, or look the other way and watch the discipline of the family erode. Many people still think this was the period when Paul's grip truly began to weaken, not because his business sense failed, but because his ability to inspire loyalty on the street was fading. Do you believe leadership in that world comes more from respect or fear? One telling episode comes when Paul calls in a captain suspected of violating the drug ban. Instead of an outright confrontation, Paul frames it as a warning. Law enforcement is circling, and anyone tied to narcotics will be on the front line of the coming indictments. The captain nods, agrees, and leaves. Weeks later, Paul hears the man's crew is still moving product. The warning has been ignored. At the same time, federal pressure is mounting. More captains and soldiers are facing indictments, and plea deals are becoming a dangerous reality. The possibility that someone might cooperate with the government, a thought once unthinkable, is now part of every boss's calculations. Paul still projects calm. At meetings, he speaks with the same measured authority he always has. He assures his inner circle that the family's structure is sound, that discipline will hold, and that the best way to weather the storm is to keep business tight and quiet. But outside those walls, the gap between his vision and the street's reality grows wider with each passing month. And in that gap, men like John Gotti see opportunity. John Gotti's impatience is no longer a rumor. It's a living force inside the Gambino family. By 1985, he's no longer just the charismatic capo from Queens. He's a power center in his own right, with a loyal crew, a network of earners, and a growing circle of allies who see in him what they feel Paul Castellano lacks: visibility, presence, and a willingness to stand shoulder to shoulder with the street. For Gotti, Paul's insulated style is more than a personal quirk. It's a vulnerability. The boss spends too much time behind the gates of his Staten Island mansion, too little time among the soldiers whose loyalty keeps the family alive. In Gotti's eyes, and in the eyes of those he's quietly courting, a boss should be seen, heard, and felt. That means showing up at wakes, weddings, and neighborhood gatherings. That means speaking directly to the men who take the risks, not always through intermediaries. Paul, however, isn't inclined to change. His philosophy hasn't shifted since he took the top seat. The less exposure, the better. He considers Gotti's high-profile lifestyle reckless, gambling in public clubs, moving through the city with an entourage, and courting the kind of attention that law enforcement can't resist. The clash between these two visions of leadership intensifies after Agnello Della Croce, the underboss who has long served as a buffer between them, becomes gravely ill. Della Croce's respect for Paul keeps Gotti in line, barely. Without him, Paul knows the risk of open defiance will grow. Many people still think Della Croce's failing health was the turning point, the moment the balance between Paul and Gotti began to collapse. Do you agree? Or do you think the break was inevitable, no matter what? Behind the scenes, Gotti begins holding quiet conversations with captains and soldiers disillusioned with Paul's rule. These aren't open betrayals, yet, but they plant seeds. Gotti's pitch is simple. The family needs a leader who understands the street, someone who won't stay locked away while others face the heat. Paul senses the shift. His inner circle reports whispers, though few are willing to name names. He responds by tightening control over key rackets and making personnel changes designed to keep the most profitable crews under his direct oversight. In theory, it's a smart move. In practice, it alienates even more people who feel their authority is being undermined. The situation is further complicated by the continuing drug rumors. Several of Gotti's closest associates are believed to be moving narcotics. Paul considers making an example of one or more of them to reinforce the ban, but he hesitates. Such a move could ignite the very conflict he's trying to avoid, especially with Della Croce's health declining. In the late months of 1985, the tension is palpable. On the surface, the Gambino family still operates smoothly. Money flows, rackets run, alliances hold. But beneath that polished exterior, lines are being drawn, loyalties are shifting, and the two men at the center of it all are moving toward a collision neither can fully back away from. December 16, 1985, begins like any other cold winter day in New York. But by nightfall, it will mark one of the most famous moments in Mafia history. Paul Castellano is in Manhattan, scheduled to meet at Sparks' Steakhouse on East 46th Street. It's a dinner appointment arranged with trusted lieutenants, meant to discuss business matters in a familiar setting. Paul, as always, arrives with an eye for routine and discretion. He's riding in his Lincoln Town car, driven by longtime associate Thomas Bellotti. The streets are busy with holiday shoppers and the glow of storefront lights. In his mind, this is a controlled environment, public enough to deter trouble, yet private enough inside to talk freely. But outside, on the crowded sidewalk, a different plan is unfolding. Multiple gunmen, dressed in trench coats and wearing fur-lined hats against the winter chill, are positioned strategically along the block. They aren't there by accident. This is a coup in motion, orchestrated by John Gotti and his allies, who have decided that Paul's leadership is over. The decision to strike here, at this moment, is calculated. The holiday crowds and the noise of midtown traffic offer cover. Sparks Steakhouse, with its bright awning and revolving door, provides a fixed point where the target will be exposed. And Paul's meticulous habits, arriving on time in predictable fashion, are the very routines that make the ambush possible. As the Lincoln slows in front of the restaurant, the gunmen close in. Shots crack through the cold air. Witnesses later describe the sound as sharp, startling, out of place even in the city's constant hum. Paul is struck multiple times before he can react. The same fate befalling Bilotti in the driver's seat. Both slump lifeless as the attackers vanish into the crowd, leaving chaos in their wake. Many people still think this was the most brazen Mafia hit in modern New York history, not only for its execution in a busy public space, but for the message it sent, that even the most insulated boss could be reached. Do you believe it was pure ambition driving the move, or had Paul's leadership truly become untenable? News of the killing spreads within minutes, flashing across police radios and newsroom wires. By night's end, photographs of Paul's body under a white sheet will run on front pages around the country. For the Gambino family, the effect is immediate: fear, uncertainty, and the knowledge that a new chapter is already being written. One in which John Gotti will step forward as the man who dared to topple the Howard Hughes of the Mafia in the middle of Manhattan. The aftermath of the Sparks Steakhouse hit is electric. Within hours, the streets buzz with speculation, not just about who pulled the trigger, but about what it means for the most powerful Mafia family in America. The public is shocked by the boldness of the killing. The underworld, however, understands immediately. A coup has taken place, and the Gambino family has a new center of gravity. John Gotti moves fast. Even before the funeral arrangements for Paul Castellano are complete, Gotti is meeting with key captains, solidifying support, and presenting himself as the man who can restore the street connection many felt had been missing under Paul's rule. For soldiers who resented Paul's corporate style and reclusive habits, the shift feels like a return to tradition: visible leadership, open interaction, and a boss who makes himself accessible. Law enforcement is equally quick to adjust its focus. The FBI, already deep into surveillance on multiple Gambino crews, pivots to documenting Gotti's consolidation of power. The Castellano murder becomes a case study for organized crime units, an example of how internal dissatisfaction, combined with the right opportunity, can upend even the most stable-seeming structure. Paul's inner circle reacts with a mix of grief, shock, and quiet calculation. Some who were loyal to him for decades suddenly find themselves pledging allegiance to Gotti, not out of conviction, but out of survival. Others quietly step back from family business altogether, sensing that the volatility of the street is about to spike. Many people still think Paul's downfall was inevitable, given the shifting culture of the Mafia in the 1980s. Others insist that with a different approach, more visibility, more concessions to the street, he could have held on. Where do you stand on it? The media seizes on the story, framing it as a clash of styles, the quiet, business-minded Castellano versus the flamboyant, media-friendly Gotti. News reports replay the narrative daily, making Sparks Steakhouse synonymous with mafia intrigue. In the public imagination, Paul becomes the symbol of an era that ended in a burst of gunfire on a cold Manhattan night. For the Gambino family, the transition is complete within weeks. Gotti installs his own loyalists in key positions, reshuffles crews, and openly embraces rackets Paul had tried to restrict, most notably narcotics. The corporate discipline that defined Castellano's rule fades, replaced by a more public, more volatile brand of leadership. And in that shift, the legacy of Paul Castellano begins its slow transformation. From the man who built a quiet empire to the boss whose end marked the return of the Mafia's louder, more dangerous face, Paul Castellano's legacy is one of contrasts, admired by some for his discipline and vision, criticized by others for his distance from the street. In life, he was the embodiment of a philosophy that saw organized crime less as a collection of street hustles and more as a conglomerate of interconnected businesses. To Paul, the Gambino family wasn't just a criminal organization. It was a corporation with him as its CEO, steering its fortunes with patience, strategy, and a strict set of rules. Under his leadership, the family reached deep into industries that generated steady, protected revenue: wholesale meat distribution, construction, trucking, and labor unions. These weren't just money makers, they were shields, giving the Gambinos influence in legitimate markets where law enforcement couldn't easily dismantle them. Paul understood that true power came from controlling infrastructure, not from fleeting street scores. Yet that same corporate mindset created the gap that ultimately undid him. Soldiers and captains who lived for the immediacy of the street saw him as remote, too insulated in his Staten Island White House to understand their world. The ban on narcotics, while smart from a legal standpoint, denied many an opportunity for quick riches. And when enforcement of that ban became inconsistent, it undermined his authority without removing the temptation. Many people still think his downfall was the product of this tension. A leader ahead of his time in some ways, but out of step with the culture of the organization he commanded. Do you agree? Or do you think any boss in his position would have met the same fate eventually? Paul's death at Sparks Steakhouse became a defining image of Mafia history. The sudden end of a reign built on quiet power, toppled in the most public of ways. For some, it was proof that no amount of strategy or insulation could make a boss untouchable. For others, it was the tragic waste of a man whose strengths were exactly what the Mafia needed to survive in an era of mounting federal pressure. In the years after his murder, the Gambino family's operations shifted dramatically under John Gotti, embracing a louder, more confrontational style that drew both public fascination and relentless law enforcement heat. Whether for better or worse, Paul Castellano's way of running things was gone. And with it, the last major attempt to mold the American Mafia into something resembling a corporate empire. For those who knew him, Paul remains a complex figure, a boss who believed in order over chaos, in profit over blood, and in the long game over the quick score. His story stands as both a blueprint and a cautionary tale, proof that in the underworld, vision and control can build an empire, but they can also isolate a king from the very kingdom he rules. So, here we are at the end of Paul Castellano's story, a tale that begins in a Brooklyn butcher shop and ends on a busy Manhattan sidewalk. It's a journey through decades of shifting streets, quiet boardroom deals, and the relentless push and pull between business discipline and the raw energy of the street. If you've made it this far, let your mind drift back over the images, those early mornings in the meat markets, the formal dinners at the White House, the measured voice of a man who could settle disputes without ever raising his tone. See the skyline he helped shape through construction rackets, the steady hum of trucks moving goods he controlled, the calculated way he built a wall of respectability around himself, even as he sat atop the most powerful crime family in America. And then picture the other side, the murmurs of discontent, the shifting loyalties, the sharp winter air outside Sparks' Steakhouse. That final moment, as sudden and final as a door closing, changed not just the leadership of one family, but the trajectory of the Mafia in New York. Now, as you settle deeper into your chair or bed, let the edges of those images soften. The noise of the city fades, the tension in those backroom conversations dissolves, and what's left is simply the story. A thread of history woven into the larger fabric of a city that's always moving. Close your eyes. Let the rhythm of the streets slow in your mind and breathe a little deeper. Another night, another tale has come and gone. And just like the men who once walked those avenues, the story slips quietly into memory, leaving only the calm that follows when the last word has been spoken.